6 months felt like both an eternity and an instant, as the galaxy prepared for war. And Theknor spent every moment of that time navigating the treacherous waters of Concordat politics, while humanity's defense force took up positions along the outer edges of known space, like a shield wall against the darkness. The council debates had been brutal, with species divided between those who believed humanity's data and those who thought it was an elaborate deception designed to secure military dominance. And Theknor had found himself arguing passionately for unity, while watching precious weeks slip away in procedural delays and political posturing. In the end, 17 of the Concordat's 23-member species had committed resources to the defensive effort, providing ships and technology and intelligence that supplemented humanity's massive fleet, though their contributions were modest compared to the 500,000 vessels that humanity had built in secret over 5 decades. Saria had returned to Earth, where she'd been reunited with her sister in the deep shelters beneath Geneva, and then volunteered to serve aboard one of the hospital ships that would follow the fleet to provide medical support for casualties, human and alien alike. Now, as Theknor stood on the bridge of his frigate, attached to humanity's third fleet, he watched the sensor displays with growing dread as the Devourer swarm finally appeared on the edge of detection range, exactly when and where Admiral Chen's projections had predicted. "Contact," announced the sensor officer, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Multiple contacts at extreme range, bearing 270 Mark 15. Estimated count exceeds 1 million individual vessels." 1 million, and that was just the vanguard of a swarm that stretched across light-years of space, moving in patterns that suggested hive intelligence, coordinating millions of individual units toward a single purpose: the extinction of everything capable of organized thought. Theknor had seen the recordings of previous Devourer attacks that humanity had pieced together from archaeological data, images reconstructed from fragments of defensive satellites and emergency beacons that had somehow survived the culling, and what he'd seen had given him nightmares that lasted weeks. The Devourers were biological horrors fused with technology in ways that violated every principle of natural evolution, creatures that ranged from the size of fighters to the scale of dreadnoughts, all of them armed with weapon systems that combined organic and inorganic components into something that transcended both, and all of them driven by a hunger that had consumed galaxies. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen," came the calm voice across the fleet-wide channel, and Theknor felt himself standing straighter as humanity's supreme commander addressed the combined forces of multiple species. "The enemy is here, exactly as predicted, and now we show them that this time the galaxy fights back." The human fleet began moving into defensive formations that they'd practiced 10,000 times in simulation. Massive battle groups that arranged themselves into overlapping fields of fire while maintaining flexibility to respond to the Devourer's adaptive tactics. And Theknor's frigate took its assigned position within the Third Fleet's screening element. "All hands to battle stations," Theknor ordered, and his crew responded with the kind of crisp efficiency that came from drilling for this exact moment since the day they'd learned the truth. "Power up all weapon systems and prepare for engagement." The Devourers advanced like a living tide, not bothering with formation or tactics because they'd never needed them before, and their approach reminded Theknor of locusts descending on a field, overwhelming through sheer numbers and relentless hunger rather than through skill or... Admiral Chen's voice came across the channel again, steady and unshakable as the range closed to weapons distance. "Remember your training. Remember what we're fighting for. And remember that every Devourer we destroy is a victory for everyone who came before us and everyone who will come after. Humanity stands with you, and we will hold this line together." The first salvos of the battle lit up space like a new star being born, as hundreds of thousands of weapons fired simultaneously across a front that stretched for millions of kilometers. And the Devourers met that wall of fire with their own horrific arsenal of organic weaponry that spat acid and plasma and things that defied categorization. Technor's frigate shook as it engaged a cluster of Devourer fighters, and he watched his tactical display as human dreadnoughts traded fire with Devourer capital ships in exchanges that generated enough energy to sterilize planets, seeing ships die on both sides. The battle devolved into the kind of brutal attrition warfare that humanity had planned for. "Target acquired," reported his weapons officer, firing main batteries. The frigate's primary cannons spoke, sending coherent beams of energy across the void to intersect with a Devourer cruiser that was attempting to flank one of humanity's carrier groups. And Fecnor felt grim satisfaction as the enemy vessel broke apart under sustained fire from multiple Allied ships. But for every Devourer they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. And as the hours of battle stretched into days, Fecnor began to understand the terrible arithmetic that had doomed previous civilizations. The Devourers could afford to trade losses because they had millions to spend, while every ship the defenders lost represented irreplaceable resources and lives. Dr. Kess sent him brief updates from the hospital ship, where she worked around the clock to save lives, both human and alien. Messages painted a picture of carnage that went beyond anything simulations had prepared them for. Casualties arriving faster than they could be treated. Medical supplies running low despite massive stockpiles. And exhausted staff working until they collapsed. "Admiral Chen is requesting all available reserves. Commit to Sector 7, came the tactical update on the 4th day of battle. The Devourers are concentrating their forces for a breakthrough attempt. Fecnor watched as humanity's response unfolded on the tactical display. Reserve battle groups moving with practiced precision to reinforce the threatened sector. And he saw Admiral Chen's flagship leading the counterattack personally. The Indomitable's massive guns tearing through Devourer formations with devastating efficiency. But the cost was horrific, and as the 5th day became the 6th and then the 7th, Fecnor watched the casualty reports climb to numbers that made his throat sacs contract with painful bitterness. Grief, human ships dying by the thousands, alien vessels adding their own toll to the butcher's bill, and still the Devourers came. "We've lost 40% of the fleet," reported his tactical officer on the 10th day, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and stress. "Human casualties exceed 200,000 vessels, Allied forces down by half, and the Devourers show no signs of stopping." But something had changed in the pattern of the battle. Something subtle that Fecnor noticed only because he'd been watching the tactical displays obsessively for days without real sleep. And he realized what Admiral Chen's strategy had actually been from the beginning. Humanity wasn't trying to destroy the Devourer swarm. That would have been impossible against such overwhelming numbers. Instead, they were making every meter of space so costly that the swarm's hive intelligence would calculate the effort wasn't worth the reward. "They're slowing," Saria's voice came through. On a private channel, exhausted but carrying a note of desperate hope, "The Devourer advance rate has decreased by 30% over the past 6 hours." Fecnor pulled up the strategic overview and saw that she was right. The swarm was still fighting, but its forward momentum had stalled, as it encountered resistance that violated every pattern of behavior it had learned over millions of years of successful culling. On the 15th day of battle, something unprecedented happened. The Devourers began to withdraw, not in defeat, but in a tactical reorientation that suggested their hive intelligence had made a calculation and decided to seek easier prey elsewhere. Admiral Chen's voice came across the fleet channel, and Fecnor could hear the exhaustion and grief and fierce pride all mixed together in her tone. "All ships, cease fire and maintain defensive positions. The enemy is disengaging." The silence that followed the last weapon discharge felt almost physical. After weeks of constant combat, and Feknor slumped in his command chair as the reality of survival settled over him like a weight. "Casualties?" he asked quietly. "Final count shows human losses at 147,000 vessels," his tactical officer reported, and the numbers felt obscene in their magnitude. Allied species lost an additional 18,000 ships, total personnel casualties estimated at 6.3 million beings, and medical facilities are still processing wounded. 6 million dead, and yet they had won, or at least survived. And as Feknor watched the Devourer swarm change course toward an uninhabited sector of space, he understood that humanity had accomplished something that no previous civilization had managed. They'd made themselves too expensive to extinguish. The fleet began the slow process of standing down from combat status, conducting damage assessments and rescue operations, and recovering the bodies of those who'd given their lives to hold the line. And Feknor watched as human and alien crews worked side by side in the grim aftermath of survival. 3 weeks after the Devourers departed, the surviving ships began returning to Sol's system, and Feknor stood on his bridge as Earth came into view, expecting to see the same darkened planet that had greeted him 6 months before. Instead, he saw light blazing across every continent as humanity emerged from their underground cities for the first time in half a century, celebrating survival and mourning losses in equal measure. And the sight of Earth alive and vibrant again made something in Feknor's chest tighten with emotion he couldn't name. Admiral Chen's final transmission to the fleet came as they entered Earth orbit, and her words were simple, but carried the weight of everything they'd accomplished together. "We held the line," she said, and Feknor could hear the tears she was fighting to control. "We stood together against extinction, and we survived. And now we have work to do, because the Devourers will adapt, and they will return. And next time, we build our defense, not as humans, or Vryn, or any single species, but as a united galaxy that refuses to die quietly." Feknor found himself in the hospital ship where Saria worked, watching as she treated a human marine who'd lost both arms, defending a breach in his ship's hull. And he asked her the question that had been haunting him since the battle ended. "Was it worth it?" he said quietly. 6 million dead, hundreds of thousands of ships destroyed. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Saria looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much death and grief over the past weeks, and her answer was simple and absolute. "Yes," she said, "because the alternative was extinction, and because we proved that intelligent life doesn't have to accept culling as inevitable. We can fight back, we can survive, and we can build something better for those who come after us." Months later, Feknor found himself writing a report that would be distributed across every Concordat world, a document that would be studied by historians and military theorists for generations. And he struggled to find words adequate to describe what he'd witnessed. In the end, he settled on something simple that captured the essence of humanity's response to the Devourer threat, writing in his native script the phrase that humans had used to describe their philosophy: "Humanity, fuck yeah." Not because they were stronger or smarter or more advanced than other species, but because when faced with extinction, they'd responded with defiance, unity, and a refusal to accept that their story was over. And in doing so, they'd given every species in the galaxy a chance to write new chapters in their own stories. And standing on Earth's surface for the first time since the war ended, watching human children play in the fields, he knew that humanity had done something truly remarkable. Parks that had been dark for 50 years, while engineers from a dozen species worked together to design the next generation of defensive systems. Feknor understood that humanity's greatest gift wasn't the fleet they'd built or the battle they'd won. It was the example they'd set. that civilizations could choose their own fate, that survival was worth any sacrifice, and that when darkness came calling, the proper response was to light a fire and dare it to advance. The Devourers would return, that much was certain, but next time, they would face not just humanity's defiance, but an entire galaxy that had learned to fight back. Admiral Chen's flagship was larger than most space stations Theknor had visited in his 3 decades of diplomatic service, and as he walked through corridors wide enough to drive vehicles through, while flanked by human marines and powered armor, he felt like he was moving through the arteries of some vast mechanical beast that humanity had conjured from their collective will. Saria walked beside him, her expression a mixture of pride and grief, as she took in the details of the ship around them. The efficiency of the crew movements, the quiet professionalism that pervaded every interaction they observed, and the subtle signs everywhere that this vessel and everyone on it existed for a single purpose: war. "This way, Ambassador," said their escort, a young lieutenant whose nameplate read Santos, and whose eyes held the kind of weariness that suggested she'd grown up in the underground cities Earth had become. "The Admiral is waiting in the strategic briefing." The briefing center turned out to be a massive amphitheater, carved into the heart of the Indomitable, with seating for what must have been 1,000 personnel, arranged in concentric rings around a central holographic display platform. And as Theknor entered, he saw that the space was already half filled with officers and specialists, who watched his arrival with expressions ranging from curiosity to carefully neutral professionalism. Admiral Chen stood at the center platform, and she gestured for Theknor and Saria to join her there, while the rest of the room settled into an expectant silence. "Ambassador, thank you for accepting our invitation," Chen said formally, though they both knew it hadn't really been a request, given the fleet surrounding his ships. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels of human government, information that only a few thousand people in all of humanity have been cleared to access, and I'm sharing it with you. Because the time for secrets has passed." She manipulated controls on the platform, and the holographic display sprang to life with an image of Earth as it had been 50 years ago, vibrant and bustling, and completely unaware of what was coming. And Theknor saw Saria's breath catch at the sight of her homeworld, in better times. 53 years ago, the deep space probe Voyager 12 detected anomalous readings from a region of space 3 million light-years from Earth, Chen began, and the display shifted to show a star field that gradually zoomed out to reveal the gulf between galaxies. At first, our scientists thought it was instrument malfunction, because the readings suggested a mass concentration that shouldn't exist in intergalactic space. The image focused on a region of darkness between spiral arms, and gradually, contact markers began appearing, thousands upon thousands of them, that coalesced into a cloud that dwarfed anything Theknor had ever seen on tactical display. "We sent follow-up probes, better sensors, and what we found changed everything humanity thought it knew about the galaxy," Chen continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. "A swarm fleet of organic technological hybrid vessels, traveling at 0.03 light speed directly toward the Milky Way, and when we analyzed their trajectory, we realized they'd been traveling for approximately 50,000 years. A murmur ran through the assembled human officers, though this information clearly wasn't new to them. And Theknor suspected this briefing was as much for their benefit as his, a reminder of why they'd sacrificed so much. "We cataloged similar swarms heading toward other nearby galaxies," Chen said, bringing up images of Andromeda and Triangulum and smaller satellite galaxies, each marked with estimated arrival times for their own devourer swarms. "Whatever these things are, they move between galaxies like locusts between fields, everything capable of organized thought, and then moving on." Saria spoke up, her voice carrying across the amphitheater. "How did you know they were hostile? Maybe they're refugees, or explorers, or—" "We hoped that too, Doctor," Chen interrupted gently, bringing up new images that showed archaeological sites humanity had investigated. So we looked for evidence of previous visits, and we found it on 37 worlds across the galaxy. Civilizations that rose to spacefaring status and then vanished completely, leaving behind only ruins that suggested sudden and overwhelming violence. The holographic display showed the remains of cities that had been scoured from their planets, orbital installations reduced to debris, and most chillingly, mass graves that held billions of beings whose species humanity would never be able to identify. "We found a pattern," Chen said, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. "Every 50,000 years, advanced civilizations appear in the archaeological record, and then they disappear, always within a span of a few decades, always with signs of defensive warfare that failed, always with complete extinction as the end result." Feknor felt cold spreading through his core as he understood the implications, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper when he asked, "The Concordat species, we're all young, aren't we? Less than 10,000 years of recorded history for any of us." "Exactly," Chen confirmed, meeting his eyes with an expression that held grim understanding. "You're the new growth that appeared after the last culling, Ambassador, and so are we, and so is every other species we've encountered in known space. We're all children of the post-devourer galaxy." She manipulated the display again, showing a timeline that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years, marked with regular intervals of extinction events, separated by long periods of silence and recovery. Someone or something created the devourers, or perhaps they're naturally evolved. We don't know, Chen said, pacing around the holographic display with the controlled energy of a lecturer who'd given this speech many times. But they fulfill a function. They prevent any species from becoming too advanced, too numerous, too capable of spreading across the galaxy. They're a reset button that gets pressed every 50,000 years. "And you've been preparing to fight them," Feknor said, looking at the officers who filled the amphitheater, and understanding now why they all carried themselves with such grim determination. "For half a century." "Yes," Chen confirmed simply. "We analyzed every fragment of data we could find about previous civilizations' attempts to resist. We studied their tactics and their failures. And we asked ourselves what it would take to actually win against an enemy that had successfully exterminated dozens of advanced species." The display shifted to show humanity's response. Diagrams of underground cities being excavated, shipyards carved into ocean trenches, resource extraction operations on a scale that boggled the mind, and population projections that showed humanity deliberately limiting their growth to maximize resources for military production. "We made choices that no generation should have to make," Chen said quietly. "Time." Feknor saw the weight of those choices in her expression. Children were born in bunkers and told they might never see the surface. Families were rationed to subsistence levels so that every excess resource could go to ship construction. Entire continents were evacuated and converted to industrial zones. And we asked 8 billion people to agree to live like that for 50 years. Saria's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. "And they agreed. All of them?" "Not at first," Chen admitted, bringing up records of debates and protests and political struggles that had consumed humanity's first decade of preparation. "We had holdouts, dissidents, people who thought we were overreacting or insane. But we made the data public. We showed everyone exactly what was coming, and eventually, the reality settled in." She pulled up an image of a referendum, a vote that had taken place across all of human space simultaneously, and the results showed a margin that was overwhelming in its unity. 92% of humanity voted to commit to the Defense Force program, Chen said, and that number hung in the air like a monument. Not because they weren't afraid or because they wanted to live underground, but because when faced with the choice between comfort now and survival later, humans chose survival. Feknor thought about his own species, about the political divisions and competing interests that characterized Concordat politics, and he tried to imagine achieving that kind of unity on anything, let alone a commitment that would span half a century and multiple generations. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he finally said, the question that had been eating at him since Chen's initial revelation. The Concordat has resources, technology, allies who would have contributed. Chen's expression hardened, and when she spoke, her words were brutal in their honesty. "Because we ran the simulations, Ambassador. We modeled it 1,000 different ways, and every time we shared this intelligence with the Concordat, the same thing happened. Debate, division, species looking out for their own interests, resources spread too thin across too many defensive strategies, and ultimately, extinction for everyone." She gestured at the assembled officers. "Humans have a saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, and when the broth is the survival of galactic civilization, we couldn't afford to let it spoil. So we made the hard choice to do this ourselves, to build an answer that would be ready when the Devourers arrived." "And now?" Feknor asked, looking at the 500,000 vessels on the tactical display. "Now we share what we've built," Chen said, and her voice carried the weight of finality. "Because the Devourers will arrive in 6 months, and while humanity is ready to fight them alone if necessary, we prefer to fight beside allies who know what's at stake." She turned to face Feknor directly, and in her eyes, he saw both hope and terrible resolve. "Take our data back to the Concordat, Ambassador. Show them what's coming and what we've prepared, and give them the choice: stand with us and fight for the galaxy's future, or scatter to protect their own worlds and face extinction piecemeal." Feknor stood in silence for a long moment, processing everything he'd learned, and understanding that his next decisions would shape the fate of dozens of species. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "I'll take your data, Admiral," he said, "and I'll present it to the Concordat Council. But I need you to understand something. The political process will take time, and 6 months may not be enough for the kind of unity you achieved." Shen nodded, as if she'd expected this response. "Then we'll buy you that time, Ambassador. Humanity will hold the line at the outer edges of Concordat space, and will make the Devourers pay for every light year they advance. And while we fight, you convince your council that the alternative to unity is extinction." As Feknor prepared to leave the Indomitable and return to his ship, he looked back at the amphitheater full of human officers who'd spent their entire lives preparing for a battle that was finally approaching, and he understood why they called themselves the Defense Force. They weren't defending Earth or humanity alone. They were defending the principle that intelligent life must stand together, or be extinguished. Life deserved to exist, that civilizations had a right to grow and flourish without being culled like wheat at harvest time. And they were willing to die to make that principle a reality. The first vessel that breached the surface of Earth's ocean was a dreadnought of such massive proportions that Feknor's mind struggled to process its scale, longer than any ship in the Concordat fleet by a factor of 5, and bristling with weapon systems that his tactical computer couldn't even categorize, and it rose from the depths, trailing waterfalls that poured off its hull like rain from mountains. But it wasn't alone, not even close to alone, and as Feknor watched with his 4 eyes wide and his breath caught in his throat, more ships emerged from the hidden shipyards that humanity had carved into Earth's crust and ocean floors and continental shelves, vessels of war that represented designs and technologies that had never appeared in any intelligence report or diplomatic filing. "Count," Feknor managed to say, his voice coming out as barely more than a croak as he watched the display fill with contact markers. "How many ships are we seeing?" Tactical officer's hands trembled as she worked her console, her usual efficiency shattered by the magnitude of what the sensors were reporting. And when she finally spoke, her voice held the kind of disbelief that came from data so unexpected that it broke existing frameworks of understanding. Contact count exceeds 50,000 and rising, Ambassador, she reported, and then paused before adding in a whisper, "No, wait, revising estimate upward, 100,000 contacts. No, 200,000. Stop, Theknor interrupted, raising one hand as he tried to process numbers that simply didn't make sense in the context of everything he knew about humanity's industrial capacity. What's the final count? The tactical officer looked at him with an expression that mixed awe and terror in equal measure, and when she spoke again, every being on the bridge heard the words that would change galactic politics forever. 512,000 vessels. Ambassador, she said quietly, humanity has launched 512,000 warships from concealed positions across Earth and its moon, and they're taking up formation in orbit around us. Saria had collapsed into her chair, both hands covering her mouth as she stared at the view screen, where Earth's sky was now filled with so many ships that they blotted out the stars, and Theknor could see tears streaming down her face, though he couldn't tell if they came from pride or horror or some combination of both. The Concordat reconnaissance fleet of 12 vessels suddenly felt pathetically small, surrounded by an armada that dwarfed every naval force in known space by orders of magnitude. And Theknor realized that if humanity wanted to destroy them, the battle would be over before they could even charge their weapons. But the human ships maintained their positions without making any aggressive moves, forming up in massive battle groups that arranged themselves with the kind of precision that spoke to years of practice and drilling. And gradually the formation resolved into something that looked almost like an honor guard rather than a threat formation. "Incoming transmission," announced the communications officer, her voice steadier now as training reasserted itself over shock. "Multiple sources, but I'm getting a priority channel from what appears to be the flagship, a vessel identifying itself as the TUDF Indomitable." "TUDF?" Theknor asked, looking to Saria for explanation. "Terran United Defense Force," she said softly, wiping at her eyes with the back of one hand. "I've never heard of it. It must be a new branch of their military, one they created specifically for this." She gestured vaguely at the view screen, where hundreds of thousands of warships hung in space, whatever this is. "Put them through," Theknor ordered, straightening in his command chair and trying to project a calm authority he absolutely didn't feel in the face of such overwhelming military power. The view screen shifted from external cameras to show the bridge of what must be the Indomitable, a cavernous space filled with hundreds of crew stations and dominated by holographic displays that showed tactical information on a scale that suggested coordination of truly massive fleet operations. And at the center of it all stood a human woman in a military uniform of dark blue and silver. She appeared to be in her 60s, if Theknor was reading human age markers correctly, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe style, and eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from carrying heavy burdens for far too long. But her posture radiated absolute confidence and competence that made her presence fill the screen. "Ambassador Theknor," she said, her voice calm and professional, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "I am Admiral Chen Zhao, Supreme Commander of the Terran United Defense Force, and on behalf of humanity, I apologize for the alarm we have caused the Concordat and our allied species." Theknor found his voice after a moment of stunned silence, and he managed to respond with something approaching diplomatic composure, despite everything he'd witnessed in the past hour. "Admiral Chen, I must confess that alarm seems like an inadequate word for what we're experiencing," he said, gesturing at the displays that showed the impossible fleet surrounding them. "Perhaps you could explain why humanity has apparently turned its entire civilization into a weapons manufacturing operation." Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been respect for his directness, and she nodded once before responding with words that would haunt Theknor for the rest of his life. "We've been preparing, Ambassador," she said simply. "Preparing for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" Theknor asked, though part of him desperately didn't want to know the answer. Chen turned to someone off-screen and made a brief gesture, and the view screen split to show both her and a star chart that depicted a section of space far beyond the Concordat's explored territories, a region where the darkness between stars seemed deeper and more threatening than normal space. 50 years ago, one of our deep space probes detected something in the intergalactic void, Chen began, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a briefing she'd given many times before. A fleet of vessels, unlike anything in our databases, traveling at sublight speeds, but on a direct course for our galaxy. The star chart zoomed in to show what appeared to be a cloud of contacts, millions upon millions of them, moving through space in patterns that suggested swarm behavior rather than organized fleet movements. And Theknor felt his skin crawl at the implications. "At first we thought they were another species from a dying galaxy," Chen continued, her expression hardening. "But when we analyzed their trajectory and compared it to archaeological data from extinct civilizations, we found something that changed everything." She pulled up images of ruins on dead worlds, remnants of species that had vanished long before humanity ever looked at the stars, and overlaid them with data that showed similarities in how those civilizations had died. Every 50,000 years, give or take a few centuries, something sweeps through our galaxy and cleanses it of advanced life, Chen said, and her words fell like hammer blows in the silence of Theknor's bridge. "The species we found in archaeological sites didn't destroy themselves. They were destroyed by these things, by what we call the Devourers." Theknor's throat sacs contracted involuntarily, a physiological response to extreme stress that he couldn't control, and he heard gasps and shocked exclamations from his crew, absorbed the implications. "You're saying there's a galactic extinction event," he managed to say, his voice coming out higher than normal. "And it's coming here, now, in our lifetime?" "In 6 months, Chen confirmed, and the preciseness of her timeline somehow made it worse. "Our projections show the Devourer's swarm will reach the outer edges of Concordat space in approximately 180 days. And based on their past behavior, they will not stop until every advanced civilization in the galaxy has been eliminated." Saria spoke up from her station, her voice shaking but determined. "Why didn't you tell us? Why keep this secret?" Chen looked at her with an expression that held both sadness and a terrible pragmatism. And when she answered, Theknor understood exactly why humanity had chosen isolation over cooperation. "Because we ran the simulations, Doctor," Chen said quietly. "We modeled every possible scenario where we brought this intelligence to the Concordat, and in every single case, the result was the same. Political paralysis, species retreating to defend their own worlds, resources scattered across 1,000 different defensive strategies, and ultimately, extinction." She gestured at the fleet surrounding them, 500,000 vessels, representing half a century of total commitment and sacrifice. "So we made a different choice. We united our species under a single purpose. We rationed every resource and turned Earth into a fortress. We moved underground so that every scrap of surface infrastructure could be converted to weapons manufacturing, and we built an answer to the Devourers." "But will it be enough?" Theknor asked, looking at the massive fleet and trying to imagine what kind of threat required such overwhelming force to counter. Admiral Chen's expression finally showed something other than professional composure, a flicker of uncertainty that humanized her after the shocking revelations. And her answer was honest in a way that made Theknor respect her, even as it terrified him. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's the best chance the galaxy has, and now that you know the truth, you need to take this information back to the Concordat and give them a choice: unite with us and fight, or scatter to the winds and die alone." The transmission ended, leaving Theknor staring at a view screen that once again showed only the impossible fleet that humanity had birthed in secret. And he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Concordat reconnaissance fleet moved through Sol system like cautious predators, entering unknown territory, their sensors sweeping across every frequency and spectrum as they searched for answers to the mystery that had brought them across dozens of light years. And the deeper they ventured into humanity's home territory, the more unsettling the silence became. Feknor watched the tactical display as they approached Titan Colony, one of humanity's oldest settlements beyond Earth, and a thriving hub of resource extraction and research facilities that normally bustled with traffic and commerce. But now, the moon's orbital space was nearly empty of ships, and the colony itself radiated only minimal power. "Hailing Titan Control," announced the communications officer, her voice tight with tension, as she opened a channel to the colony below. "Standard greeting protocols, requesting status update and docking clearance." The response came after a delay of several seconds, just long enough to be uncomfortable. And when it finally arrived, the voice on the other end sounded hollow and distant, despite the clarity of the transmission. "Concordat vessel, this is Titan Control," said a human voice that Technor didn't recognize, male and middle-aged, and carrying an odd flatness that reminded him of sedated patients he'd visited in hospitals. "We read you clearly and acknowledge your arrival. Titan Control, we're here to investigate the communications blackout from Earth," Technor said, leaning toward the pickup with his full attention focused on the conversation. "Can you provide a status report on the homeworld?" Another pause, longer this time, and Technor exchanged glances with Saria, who sat rigid in her seat, with both hands gripping the armrests, hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. "Earth is well," came the eventual reply, and those three words felt wrong in ways that Technor couldn't immediately articulate. They'd been rehearsed or programmed rather than spoken naturally. "All human colonies in Sol system are operating normally. We appreciate your concern, but request that you leave the system and return to Concordat space." Saria was on her feet before the transmission ended, crossing to the communication station with quick strides and practically pushing the officer aside as she opened her own channel to the colony below. "Titan Control, this is Dr. Saria Kess, Xenoarchaeology Division, Proxima Station," she said rapidly, her voice sharp with barely controlled emotion. "I'm calling on emergency family channels. My sister works in your hydroponic sector. Put me through to Jennifer Kess immediately." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute, and Feknor could see Saria's jaw clenching tighter with every passing second, until he thought she might crack her own teeth. "Dr. Kess, your sister is unavailable at this time." Still maintaining that same eerie flatness, "All non-essential personnel are currently in deep shelters for safety reasons. We cannot disturb them for personal communications." "Safety reasons?" Saria demanded, her voice rising. "What kind of safety reasons? What's happening down there?" "Please leave the system," came the response, and then the channel went dead with an abruptness that felt like a slap across the face. Feknor made a decision in that moment, one that he suspected might cause diplomatic complications later, but which felt absolutely necessary given the circumstances. He turned to his navigator with a gesture that meant full speed ahead. "Take us to Mars," he ordered, his throat sacs inflating with determination, "and prepare all sensor arrays for maximum resolution scanning." The fleet crossed the distance to Mars in 18 hours, using conventional drives rather than FTL to give their sensors more time to gather data. And what they found there only deepened the mystery that surrounded humanity's silence. Mars gleamed red and beautiful in the viewport as they approached, its terraformed zones showing patches of green and blue that humanity had painstakingly cultivated over 2 centuries. Engineering and patience. But the orbital shipyards that should have been bright with welding torches and construction lights sat dark and idle. The massive space elevators that connected the surface to orbital platforms hung like frozen threads against the planet's disk, their cars motionless and their cargo bays empty of the constant stream of materials that normally flowed between ground and space. And the city lights that should have blazed across the settled regions showed only a fraction of their normal intensity. Power consumption is down by 78%, reported the science officer, his mandibles clicking as he processed the incoming data. Population centers show minimal activity. Industrial zones are completely dark, and I'm detecting massive heat signatures deep underground across all major settlement areas. Saria was already working her own console, pulling up architectural databases and cross-referencing them with the sensor readings. Theknor saw her face go pale as she reached whatever conclusion the data suggested. "They've evacuated," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes wide with realization. "Every major city on Mars, every settlement, they've moved everyone into deep shelters." "Why?" Theknor asked, though he suspected she had no more answers than he did. "I don't know," she admitted, turning back to her screens with shaking hands. "But this wasn't sudden. You can't move millions of people underground without planning, without infrastructure already in place. This was organized and deliberate." The pattern repeated itself at Europa, at Ganymede, at every human settlement they checked, as the fleet moved inexorably toward Earth. And each time they tried to make contact, they received the same eerily calm responses that told them nothing, while requesting firmly that they leave the system. By the time Earth itself came into visual range, Theknor felt like he was moving through a fog. Nightmare where all the familiar landmarks remained, but everything had fundamentally changed. And when he finally saw humanity's homeworld hanging in space before him, he understood why the humans had gone silent. Earth was dark, completely and utterly dark, in ways that no inhabited planet should ever be, and the sight of it sent ice through Theknor's veins, despite the warm air cycling through the ship's life support. The great cities that normally blazed with light were invisible except as dark patches against darker continents. The orbital space that should have been crowded with satellites and stations and traffic control beacons was swept clean except for a few military platforms that tracked the Concordat fleet with obvious targeting sensors. And the electromagnetic spectrum that usually screamed with humanity's constant chatter was silent as a grave. "Full sensor sweep," Theknor ordered, his voice steady despite the shock that threatened to overwhelm him. "Composure. I want to know where everyone went." The science officer worked in silence for several minutes, his multiple limbs dancing across controls as he directed the ship's most powerful sensors toward the planet below. And when he finally looked up, his expression showed the kind of confusion that came from data that contradicted everything he thought he knew. "Ambassador, I'm reading massive thermal signatures across every continent," he reported, bringing up a global map that showed Earth's crust lit up like a circuit board. "Underground facilities on a scale I've never seen before, tunnels and chambers and complexes that extend for hundreds of kilometers in every direction." "Population?" Saria asked, her voice barely audible. "All accounted for," the officer replied, zooming in on one of the massive underground complexes beneath what used to be called North America. 8 billion humans. They're all underground, along with what appears to be the entirety of Earth's industrial capacity. Theknor was about to ask another question when alarms began shrieking across every console simultaneously, and the tactical display exploded with new contacts that appeared so suddenly they might as well have materialized from nowhere. Massive energy signatures emerging from Earth's oceans. The tactical officer shouted over the alarm, her voice cracking with shock. "Multiple contacts, hundreds of contacts, they're rising from underwater locations all across the planet." The view screen automatically refocused on the nearest emergence point, the Mariana Trench in Earth's Pacific Ocean, and Theknor felt his blood turn to ice as he watched massive bay doors open in the ocean floor. Doors so large that entire cities could have fit through them with room to spare. From those doors, from similar openings in the Atlantic and Arctic and Indian Oceans, from hollowed mountains and desert complexes and ice fields, ships began to rise. Theknor realized with dawning horror that humanity hadn't disappeared at all. They had been building, and what they had built was enough to change everything. Ambassador Theknor stood before the viewing screen in the Concordat Council Chamber, his 4 eyes fixed on the star chart that dominated the wall before him, and the empty space where Earth's signal beacon should have been pulsing with its usual rhythm of data streams and communication bursts troubled him deeply. 3 weeks had passed since the last transmission from humanity's homeworld. 3 weeks of growing silence that felt like a wound in the fabric of galactic civilization. And now the absence of that familiar chatter from Sol system had become impossible to ignore. "Ambassador, we've tried every frequency," said Coordinator Vess, her crystalline voice chiming with concern as she manipulated the holographic controls before her with delicate movements of her 6-fingered hands. "No response from Earth, no automated weather satellites, no commercial broadcasts, nothing at all." Theknor's throat sacs inflated with a deep breath, threatened to overwhelm his normally calm demeanor, and he turned to face the assembled representatives from 24 species who filled the tiered seating of the chamber. "What about the outer colonies?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the reports that had been flooding his office for the past 72 hours. "Mars responds but says little," Vess replied, pulling up transmission logs that scrolled across the air in glowing script. "Europa Station acknowledges our hails but refuses video communication. Titan Colony claims everything is normal, but their power output has dropped by 60%. And Proxima Station—" "I can speak to that," came a voice from the gallery above, and Theknor looked up to see Dr. Saria Kess standing at the railing, her human features drawn with worry and exhaustion that showed in the dark circles under her eyes, and the trembling of her hands as she gripped the metal barrier before her. The ambassador gestured for her to continue, knowing that she had been trying desperately to contact her family on Earth since the silence began, and her perspective, as one of only 3 humans currently stationed outside Sol System, would be invaluable. "My colleagues at Proxima tried to reach Earth directly using our deep space array," Saria said, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke to the assembled council. "We bypassed the relay stations and sent a focused transmission directly to Geneva, to New York, to Beijing, to Lagos, everywhere we could think of that should have responded." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing with visible effort. "Static on every channel, but not the static of destruction or interference. It's clean static, like someone just turned off every transmitter on the planet at exactly the same moment." Murmurs rippled through the council chamber as representatives conferred with their aides and consulted data streams flowing into their personal displays. Theknor could see the concern spreading like ripples across water. "Could it be a solar event?" asked Representative Mortok, his massive frame shifting in a seat designed to accommodate his species' bulk. "A coronal mass ejection that damaged their satellite network?" "Unlikely," Vess responded immediately, pulling up solar activity charts that showed Sol's behavior over the past month in calm, regular patterns. "Their sun is in a quiet phase, no unusual activity detected by any of our monitoring stations." "Then what?" demanded Ambassador Krell, her chitinous plates clicking together in agitation. "Humans don't just go silent. They're one of the most communicative species in the galaxy. They broadcast everything from political debates to entertainment programs to cooking instructions across half the star cluster." Saria descended from the gallery, walking to stand beside Theknor with a dignity that impressed him despite her obvious emotional distress, addressed the council with the kind of composure that reminded him why humanity had earned respect among the older species despite their relative youth as a spacefaring civilization. "Something has happened," she said quietly but firmly. "Something that made every human in Sol System agree to stop talking to the outside universe. And that terrifies me more than any natural disaster could. Because humans don't agree on anything easily. The truth of her words settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket, and Theknor made his decision in that moment, turning to face Coordinator Vess with his posture straightening into the formal stance of official command. "I'm calling for an emergency reconnaissance mission to Sol System," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority granted to him by 30 years of diplomatic service. "We need to know what happened, and we need answers before wild speculation turns into panic." "I volunteer to accompany the mission," Saria said immediately, stepping forward with determination blazing in her eyes, despite the fear he could see lurking behind them. "I know Earth better than anyone here, and I have security clearances that might help if this is some kind of governmental situation." Within 6 hours, a fleet of 12 ships had been assembled from Concordat forces stationed at the nearest military outpost. Fast scout vessels, equipped with the best sensors available, and enough firepower to handle potential threats without being so heavily armed as to appear aggressive. And Theknor found himself aboard the flagship as it prepared for the jump to faster-than-light travel. Saria sat in the science station beside him as the stars began to stretch and blur outside the viewport, her fingers dancing across controls as she